Our reading today is from the book of Job. It's from the very end. After Job has raged and complained and called God to court, God shows up. And the message says, Now, finally, God answered Job from the eye of a violent storm. He said, "Why do you confuse the issue? Why do you talk without knowing what you're talking about? Pull yourself together, Job. Up on your feet. Stand tall. I have some questions for you, and I want some straight answers. Where were you when I created the earth? Tell me, since you know so much. Who decided on its size? Certainly you'll know that. Who came up with the blueprints and measurements? How was its foundation poured? And who set the cornerstone while the morning stars sang in chorus and all the angels shouted in praise? And who took charge of the ocean when it gushed forth like a baby from the womb? That was me. I wrapped it in soft clouds and tucked it in safely at night. Then I made a playpen for it, a strong playpen so that it couldn't run loose, and said, 'Stay here, this is your place. Your wild tantrums are confined to this place.' And have you ever ordered morning, 'Get up,' and told dawn, 'Get to work,' so you could seize the earth like a blanket and shake out the wicked like cockroaches? As the sun brings everything to light, brings out all the colors and the shapes, the cover of darkness is snatched from the wicked. They're caught in the very act. Have you ever gotten to the true bottom of things? Explored the labyrinthine caves of the deep ocean? Do you know the first thing about death? Do you have one clue regarding death's dark mysteries? And do you have any idea how large this earth is? Speak up if you have even the beginning of an answer." There's a series of gospel billboards that have been going up around the Bay, and I think all over the country for the last few years. Maybe you've seen them. There are a few different slogans, but they all have a kind of vibe that you can recognize right away once you've seen the others. Some of them put out sentiments that would ring true to just about any Christian. They say things like, "Real Christians love their enemies," or "Jesus offers peace, hope, and rest." Some of them just seem to be very certain of themselves in a way that might make some of us progressives a little more uncomfortable, like, "Jesus, your only way to God," or "There is evidence for God." And then some sort of verge on menacing, like "The Holy Bible, inspired, absolute, final," or "Lust drags you down to hell," where hell is obviously in all caps. And next to a picture of a flatlining EKG, "When you die, you will meet God," which I have to say sounds a little like a threat. But the one that really catches my attention whenever I pass by it is the one that seems to pop up more places than all the rest. And next to an image of a book that's helpfully labeled the Holy Bible, it says, with a big red arrow pointing next to it, "Discover why Jesus created you. Call 855-FIND-TRUTH." Now, some of those other signs, they say things that are much more objectionable to me. They get much more of a rise. So I'm not totally sure why that one sticks out. I think maybe it's that the drama of fire and brimstone still isn't as exciting to me as the prospect of being certain about God. I know that a lot of us here feel this way. When it comes to God, a lot of us in this church and a lot of progressive Christians have more questions than we have answers. Maybe all we have is questions. So that certainty has a kind of attraction to it. What would you give for a copy of the Bible where someone had highlighted the proof text about why you in particular exist? What would it take to be sure that we could trust that proof? Maybe it'd take an audience with God herself, speaking from the whirlwind. So let's figure out what it'd take to be a storm chaser for God and ask, what did it take Job to get his audience with the Creator? Now, the story of Job, you might be most familiar with that from the sort of filtered pop culture version that comes to us through movies or stories, sort of as hearsay. The abbreviated pop version of that story goes something like this. Once upon a time, there was a man named Job, and he was upright and blameless. He loved his children, he feared God, and he had a pretty great life because of it. But a member of God's court called the adversary, or the Satan, convinced God to test Job. The Satan said, Job only loves you because he gets something good out of the deal. If you take away the rewards that you've given Job for being righteous, he'll stop being such a goody two-shoes and curse you to your face. So God accepted and gave Satan permission to strike everything he has. That meant the end of Job's livelihood. All of his cattle are taken by bandits and fire from God. His home, which gets collapsed by a mighty wind, and his family, who are trapped under the collapsing house, all of his sons and daughters. And so Job was devastated, but he remained obedient, and he refused to curse God. And so God was proved right, big shocker. The Satan was proved wrong, and God returned Job's fortune to him several times over, including a brand new set of kids, which I'm not even going to try to get into, and everyone lived happily ever after. The end. So that's the version that many of us know or know parts of. And there's something really weird about that version of the story, which is that it's about 40 chapters shy of the version in the Bible. And in fact, the straightforward sort of morality tale version of that is probably much older than the Bible. It was probably a folk tale in the Near East that was passed down generation to generation before it ever made it into the Bible. So the author of this Job is probably aware of that old folk tale. So I want you to imagine you're them. Imagine you're the author of Job, and you've hit a rough patch. I would guess it was hard work making ends meet as a poet in ancient Israel. Maybe you just got booed off the stage at the Jerusalem open mic night. And when you feel like you've hit rock bottom, someone gives you the 600 BC equivalent of an inspirational Instagram post or a self-certain billboard. Hey, everything happens for a reason. Remember the story of Job. Just be patient and don't get too angry at God, and you'll be rewarded before you know it. And on top of all that, you're living in a time of exile and humiliation for your people. There are people that you know or that you have heard of, family members maybe, who have been taken as prisoners of war. And you hear the whispers about them too. God rewards the righteous and punishes sinners, doesn't he? Maybe they did something wrong to be captured. Maybe they deserved it. And you're so sick of hearing those old stories used to justify other people's suffering or your own suffering. You're so sick of it that something inspires you to turn that old story on its head. So you decide you'll retell Job, but in between the setup and the payoff, you'll let Job speak. How does he feel, losing everything and then having his friends demand that he must have deserved it? All while God is apparently asleep at the wheel and letting him suffer. In this version, Job doesn't stoically accept God's will, but he's allowed to doubt and rage at God. He raises questions that his friends think are blasphemy. At one point, he actually implies that he wants to call God to court to file a lawsuit against her. And after all that, that's when God shows up in the passage we just heard. Not after Job declares that he'll serve God, but after he declares that he wants God to be served court orders. Maybe Job was finally granted his audience with God because he doubted, because he raged and asked questions, not because he was certain of his place in the world or why God created him. But certainty really does have a power to it. It gives us control, or at least the feeling of control when we don't have it. When you're sure you've gotten to the very bottom of things, when you believe that the mind of God has been opened to you, you get to believe that you know exactly what's right and what's just. You get to make yourself the hero of your own story. But if we're the hero, someone or something else has to be the villain. Or certainty can be like a painkiller. We reach for certainty and explanations to numb the pain of seeing others suffer or when we feel ourselves suffer. But if certainty is a painkiller, then it becomes a poison before very long. It's the poison that our unhoused neighbors hear when others say they probably spend all their money on booze anyway, or some people just don't want to be helped. It's the poison we heard these past weeks in the wake of the mosque shooting in New Zealand, which was distorted by Islamophobic and, frankly, racist politicians and pundits into something like a comeuppance. They acted as though it were a retribution for the sins of others. Certainty hardens our hearts, and it seems to have hardened Job's heart. He isn't certain of why this is happening. He's still doubting and raging, but he thinks he knows how God's justice works. And when our hearts are hardened like that, it might take the tough love of a parent to pierce that shell once it's set. And so, enter God's speech, which is a literal whirlwind tour of creation. God says, I have some questions for you, and I want some straight answers. Where were you when I created the earth? Have you ever gotten to the true bottom of things? Speak up if you know so much. We can demand an appearance from God. We can call him to court if we want. But what we get might be more in the vein of a few good men. We want the truth, but we can't possibly handle it. In particular, when God's giving this speech, he seems to delight in describing things that in some way aren't for us, aren't for humans at all. She asks Job about the weather where no person has ever been in the desert. Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm to water a land where no man lives, an uninhabited desert to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass? And then she lovingly describes what sound like they might be her favorite kids, Leviathan and Behemoth. And both of them are not only untamable, but they haven't been made for humans at all. About Leviathan, God says, could you shoot him full of arrows like a pincushion, or drive harpoons into his huge head? If you so much as lay a hand on him, you won't live to tell the story. There's nothing on this earth quite like him, not an ounce of fear in that creature. He surveys all the high and mighty, king of the ocean, king of the deep. You might say that the speech is meant to put God glasses on Job. It releases him from being the center of his own universe. Maybe you've experienced something like that in good worship, surrounded by other people, or maybe alone in nature, in one of those mountaintop experiences where we feel dwarfed by the hugeness of what surrounds us. And apparently that feeling is surprisingly common with those who get the chance to see the Earth from space. It's so common that it has its own name, which is fun, the overview effect. The astronaut Edgar Mitchell described the feeling like this. From out there on the moon, international politics looks so petty. You want to grab a politician by the scruff of his neck, drag him out 250,000 miles, and say, look at that. So God's neck scruffing seems to work on Job. He responds to God's speech only to say that his eyes have been opened. Job says, I babbled on about things far beyond me, made small talk about wonders way over my head. I admit I once lived by rumors of you, and now I have it firsthand from my own eyes and ears. We're reflecting this Lent on what draws us towards calling ourselves Christians, and why we do something like go to church when more and more people seem to see formal worship as something that's old-fashioned, something we're supposed to evolve beyond. Maybe part of the puzzle is the draw of the whirlwind. The state of the world can make numbness and complacency really tempting. And when we suffer ourselves, it can be easy to think we've hit a rock bottom that no one else can reach. It might take tough love to remind us of it, but the divine is kicking up dust even down there at rock bottom. And when we follow the lead of our scripture, which says that we should refuse to rest in the certainty of doctrine and received wisdom, when we let our doubts open up, we expand past ourselves and what we think we're so certain of. We might just get to see and hear firsthand the God we'd only heard of as rumor. Amen.